Well, I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar that explores the causes of health inequity. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Schuyler Center's website under the Moving on Maternal Depression project page. This is the first of two webinars that we are doing to advance the work of integrating an equity lens into the work of the Moving on the Maternal Depression project here in New York. This first webinar is a dynamic presentation that will orient participants to the causes of inequity. The second webinar will be held at 3 o'clock this Wednesday, December 11th, and will allow participants to weigh in with ideas for how this project can address those inequities as we think about strategies for improving access to maternal health, screening, referral, and treatment. Just to start with a little background on the Moving on Maternal Depression project here in New York. And with this project, we are looking to advance policies to improve prevention, screening, and treatment with an emphasis on racial equity and culturally competent services practices and the policy and systems that shape those services and practices. This project is being coordinated by the Center for Law and Social Policy, CLASP, our friends in Washington. And there are 3 states that are getting advanced technical assistance with this project: New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. There's also a broader learning community of the states listed here that's receiving less intensive TA, but are part of this broader group of states looking to improve strategies around maternal mental health. The goals of our project in New York, we're doing a lot of work around metrics and data and trying to develop key metrics and improve the way we can collaborate on data. We're trying to understand where women are screened and referred and getting treatment and try to improve the types of providers and locations where this can occur in New York. We're looking to integrate policies across state agencies and in communities. So we're looking at where there's an alignment of systems and where we can be better working together at the state level and community level to meet the needs of women and families. And we're working to engage women with lived experience. So we have instituted a Voices work group as part of this process, and they are helping us informing our structures and recommendations moving forward. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to integrate racial equity across all these goals. And so the purpose of our webinars today and this week is to help us get input into understanding how we can better do that. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Wilma Alvarado-Little, who is the Associate Commissioner at the New York State Department of Health and the Director of the Office of Minority Health and Health Disparities Prevention, to introduce our speaker today. And then following the speaker, we'll have a little time for questions, but I hope you'll all join us again on Wednesday for more in-depth conversation. So Wilma, I've unmuted you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bridget. So we are just very excited to have Dr. Martine Hackett join us for this webinar. Dr. Hackett is an associate professor in the Department of Health Professions at Hofstra University and the director of the Master of Public Health program. Her research and community-based work is focused on maternal child health, suburban health equity, and the intersection of health and housing. She's also the co-founder of the Birth Justice Warriors, which is an organization committed to eliminating Black maternal and infant mortality in Nassau County. Dr. Hackett previously served as a deputy director at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene's Bureau of Maternal, Infant, and Reproductive Health, and also has a decade of experience as a television producer. She has a BFA in Film and Television from New York University, an MPH from Hunter College, and a PhD in Sociology from the CUNY Graduate Center. Please welcome Dr. Martine Hackett.
Thank you so much, Wilma and Bridget. Hopefully you guys can all hear me. And I am...
I've turned it over to you, so you can, should be able to share your screen now.
Great. So I'm getting my presentation here, and let's do this and share and go to the beginning presentation. Okay, great. So hopefully you guys, everybody can see this, and welcome everybody to this webinar. And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to spend some time talking to you about what I like to sort of think about as the causes behind the causes, or the causes of health inequity, and really kind of just trying to give us a bit of a level setting understanding of when we talk about differences in health outcomes by race, ethnicity, or other demographic characteristics, that we sort of have a bigger space to understand the context from which these differences come. And so I recognize that the focus of this work group is, and learning collaborative is focusing on maternal depression, and I will be talking about some infant and maternal outcomes. But I think that the bigger point is that these causes behind the causes influence basically every health outcome that we see in the United States that are different by race and ethnicity. So without any further ado, let me get started and begin by just sort of, again, in the guise of level setting, let's start talking about just some definitions and the recognition of how words do matter when it comes to understanding the differences by that we're going to be discussing. So the term health disparity is something that I think many of us are obviously familiar with and has been quite popular in use. But one of the things to recognize about that concept of a disparity is that it talks basically just about a difference in a variation. It could be difference among individuals, difference among groups, but it's a descriptive term. And really what the difference that it's talking about is a difference in some sort of measurable quantity or outcome, recognizing that, yes, some groups might be disadvantaged, and there are differences that exist that might go across different categories, but that primarily a health disparity is really referring to the fact that there is a difference in a particular type of health outcome. Health inequality gets us a little bit closer to the idea of understanding what is the nature behind these differences. Though it is often interchangeable with the term health disparity or difference, the idea is that these disparities or inequalities are often between the most advantaged group in a category and the least advantaged group within a category. And so here's where we see that even though there is interchangeability between the term health disparities, which are really just measuring a difference between different groups or individuals, health inequality also sort of picks up on that concept, but perhaps with an additional lens of looking at it that to say that there are these differences exist between the most advantaged and the least advantaged groups. Health equity. Health equity is something that sort of has an even deeper meaning behind it. Because we are looking at the idea that health equity are referring to these inequalities that are not only just exist and are we can describe as existing between groups, but is also fundamentally unfair or stemming from some form of injustice. And so the concepts of inequity and equity are really political concepts because they are reflecting a larger sense that a social injustice is occurring and that the reasons for this health inequity are not just because of inherent differences between those different groups, but because of a lack of equal application of justice that reflects the differences that each group comes into the situation with. And so one of the things that might be helpful to be able to even help us think about those as differences is this image, which I'm sure many of you have seen, but I think does do a good job in really sort of identifying the differences between equality and equity. So on the left, the idea of equality is everybody gets the equal amount, right? And that there's no differences that are necessarily being identified by a particular group. However, the idea of providing, and that sounds great, right? That everybody is equal and is going to get the exact same amount. However, that does not take into account that there are certain groups who were disadvantaged before you started to implement an equality lens. The idea of equity says that we need to provide people with what it is that they need in order to create the idea of an outcome that is the same across all different groups. So equality is the idea that everybody's getting the same. However, equality, by just giving the same, you can be magnifying what those inequities are. And equity is thinking about the idea of how do we provide people for what they need based on the conditions and the situations that they are presently in. So now I'm going to start talking about some of the reasons that we see behind those reasons now that we have an idea of what some of those definitions are and the differences between when we talk about health disparities and we talk about health equity. So this quote from James Baldwin talks about this idea of history. And I think that this is a very important perspective that we need to take as we continue to look further into the reasons behind the reasons for health inequities in the United States. The idea is that history is not just something that is in the past, but is something that we are currently living with. And not only are we just living with it sometimes, but it is something present all the time. And so even though we can say that things have changed and things are not the same that they were 50, 60 years ago, we also have to recognize that the conditions that informed those differences, informed the history, informed those situations that existed are still present with us, which brings us to the concept of structural racism. And so structural racism sort of helps us to understand the ways that history is brought to the present, even though it might not look the same. So the idea of structural racism is that it refers to the many ways which societies maintain racial discrimination in ways that are embedded within systems. Things like systems like housing, education, employment, healthcare, criminal justice systems. The idea that we can see that those, or actually not see, and I'll talk about more about that in a minute, the fact that structural racism puts within these systems this reinforcing procedure that allows one group to be on the top and the other group to be on the bottom. And so we see these, the idea of structural racism is sort of the concept of baking into a system these differences between groups. Specifically, when we talk about structural racism, we're talking about whites being privileged and people of color and blacks being less privileged. And so here's where we start to see that those differences, even though they might not look the same way that they did 50, 60, 100 years ago, are still embedded and still something that we currently live with because the people have now been replaced by the systems. And so what does this mean? This means that when we start thinking about the concept of racism, not as the only the actions of individuals who are clearly acting in a way that is wrong and racist, but the idea of these structural racism and the way that that is embedded within these systems becomes, I would argue, something even more insidious because we are embedded within them. And so like a fish who doesn't really recognize where there's the water begins or ends, or that they're even in water, we see that the idea of structural racism becomes even more of a problem when they're not jumping, it's not jumping out at us, but it surrounds us. We also, the idea of structural racism is embedded also into the assumptions about how things operate. So the idea that there are going to be just differences across different neighborhoods and the quality of the schools that are within those neighborhoods, for many people is just the way things are. And so that is a result of structural racism being embedded within a system. The idea that the other reasons why their structural causes of inequities are also hard to see is because they are self-perpetuating, and they actually do not require active work to be maintained. The same way if something is built within a system, and if you build it well, it will continue on and on and on without the need for constant tinkering or the ability to put somebody out front. And one of the ways that might be helpful to think about this is with structural racism, we really are seeing racism without racists. Racism without racists meaning people who are, blocking an integration of an elementary school, where there are, not that individual who is out there in a way that we can have perhaps a vision in our mind of what a racist looks like. The idea is that these systems, however, are doing the work of the people, and the embeddedness of the structural racism within these systems means that they can continue on and over again. And we are not going to necessarily notice them unless we are looking for them. So here are some examples of the ways that this plays out. So here is an example of thinking about the differences in marijuana usage and marijuana arrests. And so we see that there is a basic similarity between the usage of marijuana for blacks and whites. However, we see quite a large difference and inequity in the arrest rates for marijuana possession. And so that idea of if the quote unquote crimes are being conducted on a similar level, why is it that we have the punishment being administered at much different levels? Again, some people can say, hey, people are, if this is a state where marijuana is illegal, they're breaking the law. And so that can be true, but the idea is that law breaking might be equal, and it's not something that is necessarily going to reflect the current status, but something that is, again, built into the system to allow it to perpetuate those differences. This is an article that, a study, I should say, that came out over 15 years ago, but it is something that has actually been cited over 2,000 times. And I just read over the weekend something from one of the authors who talked about how they have replicated the study using algorithms. And so let me tell you what the study is about. So the title is called "Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal? A Field Experiment on Labor Market Discrimination." And so basically what the experiment was to send out similar resumes, but change the name on top, one that reflected more of a traditional African-American name, one more of a traditional white name, and see who got called back for interviews. And it turns out that those who have the traditionally African-American sounding names got called back much less frequently than those with the white sounding names. And the update that I read about was that so this was done, again, about 15 years ago when, back in the day when you sent in a resume, somebody actually was looking through it, right, and deciding who to be able to call back. We know now that algorithms are very much used for online job submissions. And, on one hand, you think, hey, it's just a computer. It's just not going to, be not biased when it comes to deciding. It doesn't know the difference between Emily or Lakeisha. But it turns out that when this experiment was redone, that it did show similar differences in terms of the response rate for giving those who had African-American sounding names less of a follow-up than those who had white sounding names. Part of the reason is once you sort of, crack into the idea of how algorithms are created, they do reflect the biases that already exist in society, even though it seems that they're using quote unquote objective data and objective information. So here's where we start to recognize that this is something, the concept of structural racism is that something that is built into the system, not one person going out of their way to say, I'm going to be racist, but recognizing that the system itself perpetuates that. This is a fairly recent example of a study that also sort of shows the connection between these concepts around differential treatment and structural racism and how that plays out in health consequences. So this was a study that was done in New York City that after the 2016 election, which, as I'm sure all of you know, the rhetoric around immigration was quite strong in terms of the rhetoric around deportation and not allowing people to come into the United States via asylum while crossing the border. And so much of this rhetoric, again, we feel like that's just talk, right? That's just people, saying things. Well, it turns out when the study, the results of the study were after the 2016 election, they followed New York City births to mothers who were foreign born, particularly Latina moms, and found that they had higher rates of premature births than they had in the previous years. And so this study sort of, again, sort of illustrates the differences of how we can see the concepts around structural racism being reflected in people's bodies, right? The idea that we can see that the rhetoric or the way that people even talk about other groups of people, again, one group on the top, one group on the bottom, that can be embodied and shown as having differences, in this case with premature births. So here's where we start to recognize that the concept of structural racism actually is the part of the reason behind the reason of why we see health inequities. And so looking at this schematic, we see that if you start all the way over on the right with our sort of population health outcomes across all different types of factors and populations, many of us are familiar with the concept of social determinants of health, things like the differences in education, housing, and employment, criminal justice, how that has an influence. We know about in the differences of population health. What I'm suggesting is that we need to look at the reasons behind those differences in education, housing, employment, and criminal justice, where we could argue that it's the public policies, institutional practices, and stereotypes that cut across the history of the United States that are informing why those differences exist, which are therefore then the sort of reasons behind the reasons for the population health outcomes and the differences that we see across different groups. So let me take you through an example of how this sort of plays out. So this is the original logo for zip codes. Turns out zip codes didn't always exist. Zip codes are something that came out in the 1960s. And it was created to help people deliver mail, right? So it was for the U.S. Postal Service so that they would be able to better deliver mail to different populations. So zip codes were created to reflect different geographic areas. Something that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, however, is that today we know that this concept about zip codes mean a little bit more than just where you get your mail delivered. The phrase "your zip code is more predictive of your health than your genetic code" is something that many people might be familiar with in terms of a concept. The bigger point is that many of us know that many social programs or services are often dictated by which zip code you live in terms of whether or not you would qualify for a particular program or not based on the zip code in which you live. And so let's think about that for a minute, right? Let's think about the idea of that, 5-digit code, and I know sometimes they have like a 4-digit extension, right? But the 5-digit zip code is something where we are saying that, again, it's not just where you get your mail, but it's a number that identifies a lot about the differences in those geographic spaces where people are living, recognizing that some zip codes and the people who live there have better health outcomes and some have worse. And so, again, zip code is where we start to recognize that, hey, maybe how did that happen, right? How did it happen that people are distributed in that way, and that has led to these differences in population health outcomes? Well, one of the ways that happened is, again, thinking about the reasons behind the reasons and thinking about the concept of structural racism. So this is a map of Philadelphia that was used for determining mortgage rates, and also where community development would take place. And so some of you may know, if you look at the sort of legend on the side, that the areas that were in red were considered to be hazardous neighborhoods, and hazardous neighborhoods in terms of not good for investment, not good for investment in terms of providing federal backing for mortgages so that people could buy homes, not and hazardous in terms of investing for communities and investing for other loans for commercial businesses. And so these red areas, or red-lined areas, are spaces that, again, starting in the 1930s, were places that traditionally did not have that level of investment as compared to those blue areas, which were considered to be the best. And guess what? Those red areas were also, those red-lined areas were areas that were, how was that determined? Primarily by who lived there. When you had those neighborhoods that were red-lined, or neighborhoods that were primarily African-American or immigrant communities, and those were considered not worthy places for investment. And that is something that we continue to see today. So again, here we see a piece of history and the recognition that some groups are advantaged over others, and now we also see a connection between that and the health outcomes of those different populations. I'm going to take you through an example. I am here in Long Island today, and I am going to take you through an example of our the concept around the redlining and the outcomes of who lives in which neighborhoods and how that connects to health. So one of the things that's important to know is that Long Island is among the most racially residentially segregated areas in the United States. In part, this has to do with the fact that when Long Island was developed in the late 1940s and 1950s, Long Island, Nassau County is the home of Levittown, which is considered to be the first modern post-war suburb. Think of houses being, rapidly reproduced, and, houses that look like each other, right? Sort of our vision of what we think about when we think of a suburb started here in Nassau County. And so when those houses were built, and they were primarily built for returning GIs through the GI Bill and other sorts of subsidies that gave returning World War II veterans the ability to purchase homes at a very discounted price. It turns out that the parts of Nassau County were not available to all GIs. Specifically, African-American veterans were not allowed to purchase homes in certain parts of Nassau County and encouraged to be purchase homes in other parts. And so that leads us to where we are today. And so this is looking at Nassau County and dividing it by census tract, which are smaller geographic areas, smaller than zip codes, but include, the zip codes overall. And what we see here is that a very concentrated area, so that dark red, the legend says on the upper right, that percentage of African Americans. So these are areas that have over 50% African American residents. And on the flip side, all of those light pink areas are where there are 0 to 20% of African Americans. And so what we see is that we have a very concentrated area of where African Americans live today in Nassau County. And again, the places where African Americans don't live are the places where they were not allowed to purchase homes, in particular during that post-war period. And again, not allowed, how has that happened? Well, it turns out that were, in addition to the redlining and where people were allowed to, the mortgages that were available, there were also things called restricted covenants, which in Levittown specifically said that homes could not be sold to African Americans. And so here's where we see the consequences of that today. And if we layer on top of that, years of potential life loss or early premature deaths, deaths before age 75, it turns out that the areas in Nassau County where those are the census tracts where those are most concentrated are also the areas that are primarily African American. And so here's where we start to see, once we can sort of really, unpack the map, that the differences that we see in terms of these health outcomes are not just health disparities, but health inequities. Looking a little more closely at two zip codes in Nassau County, Hempstead and Garden City. Garden City is primarily, it's about 92% white, versus Hempstead, which is over 90% minority, both African American and Latino. And so what do we see here? So this is looking at the childhood asthma emergency department visits. And so these are children who obviously are going to the emergency room to manage asthma, which is a chronic disease. And we see in Garden City that it's 35 per 10,000 children, versus during the same time period in Hempstead, 245 per 10,000. And here's the thing, all the sick kids didn't say, sick parents of kids who have asthma said, let's move to Hempstead. And all the people who, knew that their kids weren't going to have asthma said, let's move to Garden City. The differences have to do with, think about it, what is the thing behind why a kid goes to the emergency room for asthma? It's because it's not controlled. It's because of the environment. It's because of the living conditions. And so we can hypothesize that those are significantly different in these two zip codes, which are, again, informing those differences that we see in terms of the health outcomes. But then we also have to think about what were the reasons behind those reasons. Here are two additional zip codes. So thinking back to that map I showed you overall of Nassau County, Roosevelt represents one of those areas, zip codes, that has majority minority group that live there, African Americans and Latinos, and as compared to Merrick, which is 90% white as well. And so here's where we see the infant mortality rate. So infant mortality rate is the death of an infant under 1 year for every 1,000 live births. And we see a pretty dramatic difference. In this time period, 2012 to 2014, there were 13 infants for every 1,000 births who died in Roosevelt, as compared to 0 during that same time period in Merrick. And again, we don't necessarily say that people are better or worse in terms of their overall health practices in Roosevelt versus Merrick, but we have to think about what are the protective factors that are existing in Merrick that don't exist in Roosevelt, that then allow an outcome like what we see in terms of the difference in infant mortality. Okay, so here is, again, zooming out now, thinking about not taking you out of Long Island and looking across the United States. And this is some results from a study around pregnancy-related deaths in the United States. So this is a study that just came out from the CDC, the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Review, a couple months ago. And so what this was a examination of different data that looked at pregnancy-related mortality. And so by way of definition, a pregnancy-related mortality is the death of a woman during pregnancy, immediately after pregnancy, and up to 1 year after pregnancy. And what were some of the results? Some of the results were that for women over age 30, the pregnancy-related mortality rate for Black and American Indian and Alaskan Native women were 4 to 5 times higher than they were for white women. Similarly, the pregnancy-related death rate for Black women with a college degree was 5 times more than white women with a college degree. And so this is pretty significant, and it's pretty significant, and again, it tells us that there's something else that's going on here, right? That this is not just something that has to do with socioeconomic status or education and knowledge, but that there are some reasons behind these reasons. In particular, when we look at some of the reasons for these pregnancy-related deaths, we see that they have to do with heart conditions like cardiomyopathy, hypertensive disorders, circulation issues. And think about it, hypertension is pressure, blood pressure. And so we'll talk more about that in a minute in terms of thinking about what are some of the reasons that we see such a large difference in the rates, in this case, of pregnancy-related deaths. And so here is overall looking per 100,000 live births, these differences where from the same study to see that, yeah, there's a pretty significant difference when it comes to race ethnicity. And again, is it because there's something inherent among Black women that make it more likely to be able to have a pregnancy-related death? Is there something protective for white women that make them less likely to have a pregnancy-related death? Or are we talking about things that are informing these outcomes that are not directly related to the behaviors and the genetics of that the particular people within these groups? Because in fact, risk factors cannot fully explain the African American difference in maternal and infant mortality rates. So as we look at these differences, somebody could say, well, maybe, African American women just have, more of these risk factors like low socioeconomic status, like poverty, like limited access to prenatal care, like pre-existing health conditions or mental health conditions that make them more susceptible to being to dying during and after pregnancy. And so the truth is, however, that it does not fully account for that racial gap or that difference that we see in outcomes, and that these disparities come from racial and gender discrimination over the lifespan. So here's where we see the difference between a disparity and an inequity, right? It's not just a numerical difference, but that there is a reason for this difference. Because things like the African American women who initiated prenatal care in their first trimester still had higher rates of infant mortality than non-Hispanic whites who had late or no prenatal care. And that African American women of normal weight were at higher risk of dying during the perinatal period than non-African American obese women. So again, when we start to try to tease out what are those differences, why are those differences exist, it's important to be able to see the differences in terms of health behaviors and lifestyle, but it's not sufficient to be able to explain when we look at those large inequities. So I'm going to show you guys a video now, and we tested this out before, so I'm very hopeful that this will work. But this video will take a look, and it's only about 2.5 minutes long. But Veronica is the one who is telling her own story about her own experience. And I put this in here because I thought it was important to just get that sense of when we are talking about these differences and looking at them across populations, we have to really think about what does this mean for individuals? How are individuals influenced by these systems that exist, and how are they then embodied within ourselves? So bear with me here, and let's take a look at this video, and this is Veronica in her own words.
Martine, the sound's not coming through again. When you brought up your slides, did you click the link? When you did the share?
Okay, watch. All right, I'm going to do this.
Okay.
I stopped sharing, and now I'm going to do.
You're gonna find that.
Find it.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. It's like I tell my students, it's like, these technical things think that they can get me. They can't get me. I'm smarter than them. All right, here we go.
I have 3 older siblings, one of which was born with a disability, and I was born with disabilities too, just not on the outside. When I was 8 years old, I was diagnosed with ADHD. Now, 10 years later, it was discovered that I have autism. My therapist asked me why it took so long for someone to notice, why no one took the time to notice. I couldn't answer her, but now I know why. Everyone was so focused on my sister and what was wrong with her on the outside, and that they didn't notice that there was something wrong with me on the inside, especially when I started having depression. In my community, having a mental illness is seen as a white person problem, and that being depressed means being sad all the time. But for me, depression is like an open manhole, sucking you in when you least expect it. It made me stop doing things that I loved. Special education in the Roosevelt School District was a joke. We were nothing but an afterthought. We barely got the resources we needed, and then they wondered why we did so badly on tests. If it wasn't for one teacher, though, I don't know what would have happened to me, Miss Ajiman. I entered her class soon after my diagnosis and stayed with her until I entered middle school. It was a class where you could be yourself and not feel pressured. She made me feel important. Because she made me feel important, I was able to graduate. We need to stop acting like mental illness is a problem that affects one race and recognize it as something that affects us all. The sooner we do that, the sooner the kids in our communities will feel like they're more than their illnesses again. We want to be seen.
Okay, so again, I think there's many things that can be taken from this video, but a few of them is really just thinking about the different structures that Veronica was exposed to that didn't work for her, right? Thinking about the educational system in her community, thinking about the mental health professionals, thinking about even the way the community viewed depression. And so I think that what we see here is that when it comes to thinking about the differences that we look at, we cannot divorce ourselves from the individual experiences that people go through and how they are affected, again, by these structures without even recognizing it. So let me see if I'm going to get to do this. Okay. Okay. Now I'm going to try to go to this next slide. Now here's where it might get me. Hold on a second here. So see, I don't want any of this. This is all very nice. See here. Okay. Just need to go to this next slide. Okay. So the idea of thinking about these concepts, again, can really be seen through the idea of the life course perspective, that this is recognizing that the social and economic forces can have an effect on women's development across, especially Black women's development across the lifespan, and that really another piece that is extremely important to comprehend as we're looking at these differences is stress. The way that stress, those sort of outside factors are then brought into our bodies, burden our systems, our internal systems. And so this can lead to increased levels of infection. This can lead to different reactions that our body have to to pregnancy, to stressors that happen during that time period. And so thinking about this, thinking about the idea of a life course, thinking about the idea of the lifetime exposure to things like structural racism, make us recognize that when we see these differences, we have to also understand what are some of those reasons behind those reasons. Another thing to take into consideration, again, are the structures that exist. And so this is a study that just came out talking about housing stability and its effect on perinatal outcomes. And the study basically found that unstable housing is associated with adverse obstetric outcomes and high health care utilization, and that the recommendation is not to have women go into prenatal care earlier. The recommendation is that housing is something that needs to be taken into consideration as a factor that influences health outcomes. And so thinking about this, right, we can think about that when we look at those maternal mortality and infant mortality rates that we're talking about, the tip of the iceberg. and that we need to recognize that maternal morbidity, which are near deaths, or preterm birth and low birth weight are just underneath that surface and happen, affect so many more women and infants, but that those are influenced by pre-existing conditions that, again, are disproportionately affecting the communities of color. And what is affecting that idea of that toxic stress, the weathering over the life course, and medical system structures, and what is underneath that to the concepts of structural and interpersonal racism, unconscious bias, and economic stability. So when we look at our outcomes, we have to recognize that there is much underneath the surface that is also influencing it. Again, many of us might be familiar with this as social determinants of health, where we can look at our individual lifestyle factors are necessary, but not sufficient to be able to explain why those differences exist, because our individual lifestyle factors are influenced by our social and community networks, which are influenced by our living and working conditions, which are influenced by the larger socioeconomic and environmental conditions. And so when we think about this, we can recognize that structural racism sort of sets up the table over and over again to serve up poor population health outcomes, because again, this is something that we carry with us, and it's something that is largely invisible, yet continues to play an extremely important role in why we see the differences that we see. So thinking about the causes of the causes, when we look at those health disparities or differences, we have to see them for being influenced by those social determinants of health, but we also recognize that those stereotypes, policies, and the structural racism that privileges some groups over others, even though it seems invisible, are the things that are also influencing why those differences exist. And that becomes the concept of equity or inequities, because not everybody is getting not only the same thing, but that there are differences in terms of what people are receiving that then present themselves as differences in health outcomes. When it comes to thinking about what do we do about this, there is a lot to take into consideration, but I bring to your attention just these concepts of some foundational practices that can be used to consider the ways that we would approach health equity. And in fact, the idea of the understanding of what health is and understanding the different definitions is a great start. And understanding what we're talking about when we talk about the things that influence those different health outcomes, in addition to using data to advance health equity. So you don't know it if it's invisible, you don't know that injustice exists. And so making injustice visible through data is a very powerful tool to be able to do that. And so again, thinking about the ways that we can address health equity is going to require the same level of focus that it did to be able to get to this point. And when we can recognize what is embedded within those structures, then we can start to be able to dismantle it. Because here's my last slide, thinking about the idea of when it comes to being able to address these issues. Dealing with them on a sort of downstream case-by-case level might feel necessary, and it is necessary, but it's not going to get at that larger reason for why those differences exist. And so we have to recognize that there are those larger reasons behind the reasons, or causes behind the causes at work, and to be able to say what are the ways that we can address those in order to be able to have a more equitable outcome across all populations in New York State. And so this is my information. Please feel free to reach out to me and follow the work that we do with Birth Justice Warriors or other entities. And so I'm happy to be able to spend this last couple minutes answering any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I am going to, this is Bridget. I'm going to open it up to questions. I'm going to try to get the screen back here. All right. So if people can we have some time for questions, but we also, I just want to remind you that there's another webinar on Wednesday at 3 that will allow for a more in-depth conversation on some of the concepts that Martine talked about will give people an opportunity to talk about the work that they're doing, and make some suggestions to us about how to put an equity focus on the work that we're doing. So I'm trying to get the screen back here, but if people have questions, if you'd like to raise your hand, and I will unmute you. Oh, there's a comment in the chat box. How can we address limited access to mental health services for underserved low-income minority population if structural racism is heavily embedded in systems politically that block the ability of these mothers to even reach their equity goal?
Yeah, so I think I think first of all, what I, just even hearing that question is that recognition that there are those factors at play that are not just the fact that, women don't want to go for their, appointments, but that, all of those things, right, that there's lack of resources, but also other structural conditions that are barriers. And so I would say, that's an extremely important concept, is thinking about the way that plays out in terms of the why we see those differences. And so one thing I would say is that it's important to, and this goes back to the idea of data, to document what services are not available, what is missing when it comes to looking at those referrals that cannot be filled, right? And so I think that then becomes information for advocacy, because I'll tell you what, when it comes to being able to address concepts like structural racism, there has been a lot of investment to maintain it, right? And so just sort of calling it out is not going to be enough to be able to undo it. And so I would say that it needs to be, as much as possible, the idea of documenting, objectively measuring and quantifying, and then advocating for the ways to be able to address it through that lens of the concepts around the structural inequities that exist.
Okay, I think we're going to be doing a lot of work on that. I'm going to unmute Amanda Martin.
Oh, yes. I just typed in my question. I have colleagues that would be very interested in seeing this webinar, and I wondered if we would have access to the recording or the slides.
Yes, those will be posted on the Schuyler Center's website, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to get back to my slides here to show you. But yes, we will post that on the Schuyler Center's website, and
okay.
A recording of today and the slides.
Thank you.
There we go. And if you have not signed up for the webinar on Wednesday and you'd like to do that, my email is there, is on the screen, and you can email me if you don't have the link to register, and I will get that to you today, and you can register for that. Any other questions for either the chat bar? This is Bridget. I just had a question. I guess I don't know if it's as much of a question, but just sort of something for us to be thinking about and get your comments on. If you talked a lot about life course issues, and if we're focusing on maternal mental health issues beyond just looking at maternal depression, but sort of more broadly, when you're thinking about the life course, what would you be having us be focused on in terms of addressing maternal mental health in an equity standpoint, in terms of at what point should we be really focusing our efforts at getting women screened for all sorts of types of mental health issues? Where should we be focusing besides maternity? Oh, did we lose Martine?
Oh, I'm sorry. That was a question for me?
Yes.
So I think in the example of Veronica's story, right, that she talks about as a teenager, being exposed to, issues around mental health and some of the stigma that she encountered with that. And so I think that there are many levels to this. I think one of them is the idea of making this something that is more acceptable. And I think that, I will say that I have seen that, more recently, right, where, students now can take a mental health day as one of their sick days, where there is a pretty concerted effort around high school students and younger even to make mental health recognized as a legitimate issue that can impact many levels of your life, to remove that stigma. And so I think that that is an important concept to be able to address at that early stage, because we know that in the case of maternal depression, not always, but it often has a pre-existing experiences with mental health issues that are then exaggerated during pregnancy and afterwards due to hormonal changes. And so I think it's really thinking about that at a very young age for all people.
Okay. We have one more question here in the chat box. I'm curious if you know of any models for community-based mental health care that involve not just licensed mental health professionals, but also a spectrum of peer and group-based support.
So mental health is not my area of expertise, so I definitely do not want to talk about stuff that I do not have great experience in. But I can speak a little bit of the idea of peer support that has been found in different outcomes when it comes to maternal child health have been found to be successful. And so these are things like doula programs where there is support for women during pregnancy and after pregnancy. Also things like centering pregnancy or centering parenting programs where, again, the social support is a very foundational characteristic of those programs. The thing that I'll just sort of also just throw in there is that I feel sometimes very hesitant around thinking about, saying like, oh, how great your programs are in terms of being a panacea, because of the level of training or the lack thereof, right, of individuals. And so we certainly do not want to shift the burden to peers. So in terms of that level of responsibility or activity, but I do think that there have been, like I said, some evidence-based models that really do show that decreasing social isolation, increasing social cohesion certainly does have a role in improving all kinds of health outcomes.
Great, thank you. All right, I see there's some folks typing some stuff in the chat box around transportation, childcare availability. I think this is all great. This is what we're hoping to capture on Wednesday in our additional conversations about this. What kind of supports and things can we be thinking about as we start to address some of these issues in the work that we're doing. So it's 4 o'clock now, so I'm going to end today. And again, my contact information is on the slide here. You can send me an email if you haven't registered for Wednesday. We will also be recording Wednesday as well. So if you can't attend, you can get the recording of that later. Thank you all very much. We appreciate your attending today. And thank you very much, Martine, for taking the time to talk with us about these issues. We look forward to working with you some more. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks.